What life of ancient Babylonians was like. Babylon was the largest city in Mesopotamia. Its streets were surrounded by tall walls with doors. Behind the doors, there were open-air courtyards. Babylonian families lived close to each other. Family homes were passed down over the generations. Family burial plots were often under the courtyard. Ancient Babylonian society was patriarchal. However, women had more rights than in later civilizations. They could represent themselves in court. They owned property and passed it down to their children. They held positions as priestesses and officials. A Babylonian man would rarely take a second wife. It was only allowed if the first wife couldn't bear a child. The class wasn't rigid in Babylonian society. The king and his royal line were on top. They were followed by the chief priests and priestesses. There was the landowning class, Avalum, and there were commoners, called Mushkanim. They were free but didn't own land. Slaves belonged to the wardom class. In many cases, slavery was a temporary state. Commoners who fell into debt were enslaved. They worked for their creditors until the debt was repaid. Other Babylonian slaves were captives of warfare. Their families couldn't pay their ransom. Most of Babylon's agricultural land belonged to the king, but some people owned and managed private land. It was tended to by hired and conscripted labor. Soldiers were allotted parcels of land. They didn't own the land, but got a portion of its harvest. Barley was the staple crop for bread and beer. Babylonians harvested dates from date palm orchards. They also grew vegetables from smaller garden plots. Babylon had a system of hand-dug canals and levees. They supplied water from the nearby Euphrates River. Sheep were the source of Babylon's textile industry. Sheep naturally shed their coats in the spring. Workers combed and plucked their wool. Babylonian women worked as weavers. Woolen textiles were traded with neighboring kingdoms. Babylonians worshipped a large pantheon of gods. They had temples dedicated to major deities. Inside each temple was a cult statue of the god. Only temple workers could enter the god's presence. The statue had to be fed wine and beer 3 times a day. It was offered clothed with jewelry. On festival days, the gods were paraded through the streets. Babylonians believed their courts to be the fairest. Each court was overseen by 7 judges. Rulings were determined by majority opinions. The judges could call for an independent investigation. Every contract and business deal required witnesses. They had to swear an oath to the gods. Wars in Babylon were very much planned. Diplomats would decide on a date and time for a battle. A single battle would often decide who won. However, King Hammurabi started building an empire. In 13 years, he conquered 17 neighboring kingdoms. His armies tried to capture enemy soldiers for ransom. A prisoner's ransom was often paid by merchants. They could bring the prisoner back to his home country. Sometimes a family was too poor to pay the ransom, so the responsibility fell on the temple. If the temple couldn't pay it, the palace covered the debt.